They say that in Chicago, the wind doesn't just blow, it bites. It strips you down until you find out what you are truly made of. But on this particular December night, the sharpest cold wasn't found on the snowy streets of the South Side. It was waiting inside the gold-plated walls of the Sovereign Arms Hotel. It was here that two worlds were destined to collide. On one side stood Bradford Sterling, a billionaire who believed that every man, woman, and child on Earth had a price tag. On the other stood Caleb Hayes, a 12-year-old boy wearing his dead father's oversized blazer, who possessed nothing but a desperate need for $600 and a secret that money couldn't buy. It started with a laugh. It ended with a silence that shook the room. This is the story of how a boy with empty pockets taught the richest man in the city the true definition of wealth. The overhead of a train roared past, shaking the cracked ceiling of the basement apartment and momentarily drowning out the gentle, rhythmic voice speaking Dutch from the old, battered radio. Caleb sat at the scratched kitchen table, his hand hovering over the volume dial. He didn't flinch at the noise. He was used to the world shaking around him. He simply waited for the steel thunder to fade, leaving only the hissing of the radiator and the calm, foreign words flowing from the speaker. It was a Philco model, older than he was, with a cracked casing that held together the only remaining piece of his father. Caleb adjusted the dial with the care of a safecracker. "Geduld is the sleutel," the voice whispered. "Patience is the key." Caleb repeated the phrase, shaping his mouth around the vowels, just as his father had taught him years ago. Across the room, the atmosphere was far less peaceful. Ruth Hayes stood by the sink, gripping the telephone cord so tightly her knuckles had turned white. She wasn't looking at Caleb. She was staring at the frost creeping up the corners of the high, narrow window that looked out onto the sidewalk level. "Mr. Henderson, please," she said, her voice low and desperate. "It's Christmas in 3 days. I picked up an extra shift tonight. I will have the money by morning." A harsh, crackling voice barked from the other end of the line. Ruth's shoulders sagged, shrinking under the weight of the words. "I understand," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Tonight. $600. Or we're out." She hung up the phone gently, as if slamming it might shatter the fragile reality they were living in. $600. In that freezing basement apartment. It might as well have been $1 million. She leaned against the counter, closing her eyes for a moment, before the phone rang again. The sound was sharp, demanding. Ruth picked it up, expecting the landlord again, but her expression shifted from fear to a frantic sort of hope. "The Sovereign Arms?" "Yes, this is Ruth. Yes, I can come in. A VIP banquet." She glanced at Caleb, biting her lip. I don't have a sitter, sir. I'll have to. Yes, he'll be quiet. Thank you. I'm on my way." She hung up and turned to her son. The exhaustion etched into her face was softened by a look of fierce love. "Get your shoes on, baby," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "We have to go. Now." Caleb didn't ask questions. He knew the look in her eyes. He stood up and walked to the small closet in the hallway. Reaching past his own thin windbreaker, he pulled out a charcoal blazer that hung in the back. It smelled faintly of cedar and old paper. He slipped his arms into the sleeves. The jacket was absurdly large on his 12-year-old frame. The shoulder pads drooped, and the cuffs swallowed his hands. But Caleb didn't care. He buttoned it carefully, standing a little taller. It was his father's suit, his armor against a world that tried to make him feel small. Ruth watched him, a sad smile touching her lips as she saw the ghost of her husband in the boy's proud stance. She grabbed her purse and ushered him toward the door, wrapping a thick knitted scarf around his neck to fill the gaps where the oversized collar let the cold air in. She opened the heavy door, and the biting Chicago wind rushed in to greet them, carrying snowflakes that felt like ice. Ruth squeezed Caleb's hand tight, pulling him close as they stepped out into the gray twilight. "Stay close to me, Caleb," she whispered, her breath forming a cloud in the freezing air. "We just need one miracle tonight." The revolving doors of the Sovereign Arms spun like a golden carousel, sweeping them out of the gray snow and into a lobby that smelled of expensive pine and old money. The transition was violent in its suddenness. One moment they were shivering in the biting wind, and the next they were enveloped in a suffocating warmth, surrounded by marble floors that shone like mirrors and chandeliers that dripped with crystal tears. Caleb blinked, his eyes adjusting to the brilliance. He instinctively reached up and touched the lapel of his oversized blazer, his fingers brushing the worn fabric as if to remind himself of who he was in this palace of strangers. Beside him, Ruth's demeanor changed instantly. She hunched slightly, making herself smaller, her eyes darting nervously toward the front desk as she hurried them toward the staff-only door hidden behind a potted palm. Inside the service corridors, the air was thick with the smell of industrial cleaner and the frantic energy of the kitchen. "Listen to me, Caleb," Ruth whispered, pulling him into a shadowed alcove near the entrance of the grand ballroom. She pointed to a velvet bench that had been discarded there. "You sit here. You don't move. You don't speak to the guests. If anyone asks, you're waiting for your mother. Do you understand?" Caleb nodded solemnly. He watched as his mother pinned a name tag onto her uniform, transforming from the woman who sang along to the radio into just another invisible pair of hands in the machinery of the hotel. She smoothed her apron and disappeared into the crowd of servers, leaving Caleb alone in the semi-darkness. From his vantage point, Caleb watched the wealthy guests pass by the open double doors. Men in tuxedos that fit perfectly, women in gowns that shimmered like liquid light. They laughed with their heads thrown back, holding flutes of champagne, moving with the easy confidence of people who had never worried about a rent payment in their lives. Caleb felt like a ghost haunting a feast he could never join. He observed their body language, the boredom in their eyes, the way they looked through the staff as if they were furniture. He pulled his father's jacket tighter around himself, feeling small, yet his mind remained sharp, cataloging the snippets of conversation that drifted his way: stocks, mergers, summer homes in the Hamptons. Suddenly, the hum of polite conversation was shattered by a commotion near the service entrance. A young man in a frantic, ill-fitting suit, Assistant Miller, was pacing in circles, shouting into his cell phone. His face was pale, slick with sweat. "A car accident? No. You have to be kidding me," Miller hissed, his voice cracking with panic. He listened for a second, then slammed the phone down, running a hand through his hair. He grabbed the arm of a passing security guard, his eyes wide with terror. "It's over. The interpreter is in the hospital. Sterling is going to kill us. Vanderberg walks in 15 minutes, and we have no one to speak Dutch. The deal is dead." Caleb, sitting unnoticed on the bench, hears the word Dutch. He freezes, his heart pounding against his father's blazer, and looks at his mother, who is too busy taking coats to notice the opportunity that just walked through the door. The double doors to the grand ballroom burst open, and the booming voice of Bradford Sterling spilled into the hallway, silencing the string quartet mid-note. The sheer volume of his anger seemed to suck the oxygen out of the corridor, freezing the staff in their tracks. Through the gap, Caleb could see the billionaire standing at the head of a long mahogany table, his face a mask of red fury, gesturing wildly at a group of terrified assistants who looked ready to faint. "I don't care about excuses," Sterling roared, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "I don't care if you have to fly someone in from Amsterdam right now. Fix this, or you're all fired." On the velvet bench, Caleb's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He looked at his mother, who was pressed against the wall, clutching a tray of empty glasses, her eyes wide with fear. She looked small, defeated, terrified of losing a job that barely paid the bills. Caleb's hand tightened around the fabric of his oversized blazer. He remembered his father sitting at their kitchen table, surrounded by dictionaries, tapping his temple. "Your value isn't what they see, Caleb," he had said. "It's what you know. Knowledge is the one thing no man can take from you." Caleb took a deep breath. He knew something they didn't. He had value. Before fear could paralyze him, Caleb stood up. Ruth saw the movement and her eyes widened in panic. She lunged forward, whispering frantically, "Caleb, no. Sit down." But he was already moving. He slipped past her outstretched hand, moving with a quiet determination that belonged to a man twice his age. He walked toward the open doors. 2 security guards stood at the entrance, formidable men in dark suits, but they were so distracted by the chaos inside and so utterly confused by the sight of a small black boy marching forward in a suit 3 sizes too big that they didn't react in time to stop him. Caleb crossed the threshold. The transition was instant. He walked from the shadows into a blaze of light. The grand ballroom was cavernous, filled with the scent of lilies and tension. As Caleb walked steadily toward the center of the room, the shouting died down. One by one, heads turned. The silence spread like a wave until the only sound was the soft tap-tap-tap of Caleb's worn sneakers on the polished marble floor. He stopped 10 feet away from the main table. Bradford Sterling stopped mid-sentence, looking down with an expression of sheer incredulity. He looked at the boy, then at his security team, his eyes cold and hard as flint. "Who?" Sterling demanded, his voice dangerously low. "Let this street kid in here?" Caleb didn't flinch. He didn't look at the floor. He lifted his chin, meeting the billionaire's gaze with a steadiness that unsettled everyone watching. He ignored the whispers, the snickers from the back of the room, and the terrifying power radiating from the man in front of him. "I can translate, sir," Caleb said, his voice trembling slightly but clear enough to reach the back of the room. "I speak Dutch." Sterling blinked, taken aback for a fraction of a second, before a cruel, mocking smirk twisted his lips. He looked around the room as if inviting everyone to share in the joke. "You," he laughed, a harsh sound that lacked any warmth. "And what's your price, boy?" Caleb stood tall, smoothing the front of his father's blazer. $600. "Sir." A boom of laughter erupted from Bradford Sterling, echoing off the crystal chandeliers like harsh thunder, causing several guests to cover their smiles behind champagne flutes. The sound was physical, a wave of dismissal that washed over the room. $600? Sterling wheezed, wiping a tear from his eye. "Kid, I tip my doorman more than that just for smiling. You think you can walk in here, looking like you raided a costume shop, and save an $80 million deal?" He waved a dismissive hand at the security guards, his amusement vanishing as quickly as it had arrived. "Get him out. I'm done with this circus." The guards stepped forward, their heavy footsteps closing in. Caleb felt the heat rise in his cheeks, the stinging humiliation that threatened to make him shrink. He tightened his grip on the lapels of his father's blazer, feeling the rough wool under his fingertips. It grounded him. Patience is the key. Caleb didn't back away. Instead, he did something no one expected. He turned his back on the billionaire. He looked past the approaching guards and locked eyes with the older man sitting quietly at the end of the table, Johann de Vries. Caleb took a breath and spoke, his voice dropping the trembling uncertainty of a child and adopting the rhythmic cadence of the radio broadcasts. "Meneer de Vries, Grootheid is vak verborgen op klein plaatsen. Zullen we doorgaan?" "Mr. de Vries, greatness is often hidden in small places. Shall we proceed?" The effect was instantaneous. De Vries, who had been closing his leather briefcase, froze. His head snapped up. He looked at Caleb, really looked at him, studying the oversized jacket and the fierce intelligence in the boy's eyes. Slowly, a genuine smile broke through his stern expression. He sat back down and replied in clear, rapid Dutch, ignoring Sterling entirely. "I am listening, young man." The security guard stopped, unsure what to do. Sterling looked between them, his mouth slightly open, confused and suddenly powerless in his own boardroom. The negotiation began. It was a trial by fire. De Vries didn't go easy on the boy. He spoke in dense, technical sentences about carbon emission targets, infrastructure grids, and long-term liquidity. Caleb didn't stumble. He closed his eyes for a split second, letting the words arrange themselves in his mind, then opened them and translated into precise, clear English. He became the bridge. When Sterling, recovering his bluster, tried to bully de Vries on a timeline clause, barking a demand that sounded like a threat, Caleb didn't just translate the words. He translated the intent. He softened the tone in Dutch, turning an ultimatum into a firm request, keeping the dialogue flowing where it would have otherwise snapped. For an hour, the ballroom remained in a trance. The guests who had snickered were now straining to hear, watching the small figure in the charcoal suit command the room. Sterling stopped seeing a street kid and started seeing the deal of a lifetime coming together. Finally, de Vries nodded. He pulled a gold pen from his pocket and signed the thick document on the table. The scratch of the pen against paper was the only sound in the vast room. It was done. De Vries stood up, buttoning his jacket. He shook Sterling's hand briefly, but his eyes were cold until he turned to Caleb. He pointed a finger at the boy. "You are lucky, Bradford. This boy is the only reason you just made $80 million. The heavy oak doors closed behind the last guest, leaving the vast ballroom empty except for the billionaire, the boy, and the silent echo of a victory that felt heavier than gold. The silence was thick, pressing against the eardrums after the roar of applause that had just ended. Bradford Sterling stood by the table, loosening his silk tie as if the sudden success was choking him. He looked at Caleb, really seeing him for the first time without the lens of irritation. For a split second, the image blurred the boy's oversized blazer, the defiant set of his jaw, the hunger in his eyes, and Sterling saw a ghost. He saw himself 40 years ago, wearing second-hand clothes in South Boston, hungry to prove the world wrong. The memory was sharp and uncomfortable, and he pushed it away with the only tool he knew how to use: money. Sterling reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick leather wallet. He didn't just pull out a few bills, he emptied it. He counted out crisp $100 bills, the paper snapping loudly in the quiet room. 1,000. 2,000. 5. 6. He held the thick stack toward Caleb, a peace offering wrapped in arrogance. "Here, kid," he grunted, his voice gruff but lacking its earlier bite. "You earned it. Take it all. $6,000. Ruth gasped, the sound echoing in the empty room. Her hands flew to her mouth. $6,000. That wasn't just rent. That was heat for the winter, new coats, food in the fridge, maybe even a used car so she didn't have to take the bus. Tears welled in her eyes as she stepped forward, her instinct to survive overriding her pride. "Oh, sir, thank you," she began, reaching out with a trembling hand. But Caleb moved faster. He stepped between his mother and the money. He took the stack from Sterling's hand. The billionaire smirked, expecting the boy to stuff it into his pockets, expecting greed to win as it always did. Instead, Caleb lowered his head. With agonizing slowness, he counted. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. He folded the $600 and tucked them neatly into his breast pocket. Then, he held the remaining $5,400 back out to Sterling. "No, sir," Caleb said softly. Sterling's smirk vanished. He stared at the money as if it were radioactive. "What are you doing?" he snapped, his face reddening with a mix of confusion and insult. "Are you stupid? It's 10 times your price. Take the damn money." Caleb didn't retreat. He stood tall in his father's suit, looking the billionaire in the eye with a calmness that shattered the air between them. "My father taught me that integrity is the only thing you truly own," Caleb said, his voice steady. "If I take more than I earned, I'm accepting your charity. I'm admitting that my price can be bought. I am not for sale, Mr. Sterling." Sterling stood frozen, his hand extended with the rejected $5,400. The air left his lungs as if he'd been punched in the gut, the ghost of his own mother suddenly screaming in his memory, her voice merging with the boy's, repeating the same lesson he had buried under decades of greed. The silence stretched, broken only by the sharp, ragged intake of breath from a man who hadn't let himself cry in 30 years. Bradford Sterling lowered his hand, the rejected bills fluttering to the marble floor like fallen leaves, ignored. He didn't look angry anymore. He looked old. He looked human. The armor of his wealth, which had seemed impenetrable just an hour ago, had been pierced not by force, but by the quiet dignity of a boy who had nothing but a coat that didn't fit and a code of honor that did. Slowly, awkwardly, the billionaire dropped to one knee. His expensive suit pants hit the hard stone, but he didn't seem to notice. He brought himself down until he was eye level with Caleb. "I owe you an apology," Sterling said, his voice thick with emotion. "When you walked in here, I laughed. I laughed because I forgot." He swallowed hard, fighting back the tremor in his chest. "I forgot that poverty doesn't mean a lack of value. I forgot where I came from. Thank you for reminding me." Caleb nodded, accepting the apology with the same grace he had accepted the challenge. "You're welcome, sir." Sterling stood up, wiping his face with a handkerchief. He turned to Ruth, who was still trembling, clutching her tray as if it were a shield. But Sterling didn't see a waitress anymore. He saw the mother who had raised a king in a basement. He didn't insult her by offering charity again. Instead, He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a plain white business card. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, his tone respectful, almost deferential. "We need people with character in our management division. Skills I can teach. Integrity, I cannot." He pressed the card into her hand. "Please come see me Monday morning. And bring the boy." Ruth stared at the card, tears finally spilling over, washing away the fear of the last few months. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you." They walked out through the golden revolving doors, leaving the chandeliers and the stunned billionaire behind. The Chicago night was waiting for them, but as they stepped onto the sidewalk, the biting wind didn't feel quite so sharp. The snow fell softly, coating the city in a blanket of white peace. Ruth stopped under the glow of a street lamp and pulled Caleb into a fierce embrace, burying her face in the shoulder of the oversized blazer. "We did it, Caleb," she sobbed, laughing through her tears. "You saved us. You really saved us." Caleb hugged her back, feeling the crisp edges of the $600 safe in his pocket, enough for the rent, enough for home. He looked up at the snowy sky, where the clouds were parting just enough to reveal a single star. He patted the pocket of his father's blazer, feeling the warmth radiating from within. "No, Mom. Dad did." The Health train roared overhead, shaking the ground beneath their feet, but this time it didn't sound like noise. It sounded like applause. Sometimes, the greatest lessons come in the smallest packages, wrapped in oversized coats and worn-out shoes. Caleb didn't just translate a language that night. He translated a truth we often forget, that dignity cannot be bought, and a person's value is never determined by the balance in their bank account, but by the integrity in their soul. As you go about your life, remember to look past the surface, because you never know when you might be standing in the presence of a king in disguise.